10 unique Skinwalker encounters, true horror stories that will horrify you. Story 1, the night clerk's last shift. The graveyard shift at the Four Corners Fuel and Go was a study in fluorescent isolation. The station sat on a long, flat stretch of Route 160 where the asphalt shimmered all day with heat mirages, and at night it became a glass island in an ocean of blackness. I'd been working there 3 months, and the silence had a texture, a low, ambient hum that seemed to vibrate up through the concrete floor. The cooler compressors kicked on and off with a weary rattle. The slushy machine bubbled eternally, a sugary magma of blue and red. Outside, the desert after midnight was an absence so profound it felt solid, pressing against the windows like a held breath. My only company was the buzzing of the overhead fluorescence, a frequency that settled into your teeth and stayed there. Around 2 a.m. I was restocking the energy drink cooler, my fingers numb from the cold, when the electronic door chime pinged. The sound was jarringly cheerful, a 2-note jingle that belonged in a convenience store commercial, not this lonely outpost. I straightened up, rubbing my hands together, and saw her. A woman stood just inside the doorway, perfectly still, as if the shadows had simply condensed into her form. She was barefoot. Her feet were dark with red dirt and something else, the soles cracked and calloused in a way that suggested she had walked a great distance over rough ground. She wore a stained, oversized flannel shirt that hung past her knees, the sleeves rolled up to reveal thin, sinewy forearms. Her black hair was tangled, woven with bits of sagebrush and what looked like small animal bones. She didn't walk in so much as materialize. I hadn't seen a car pull up, hadn't heard an engine. Just the chime and then her. "Evening, ma'am," I said, forcing the customer service brightness I'd been trained to use. "Can I help you find something?" She didn't answer. Her head moved in a sharp, avian jerk toward the slushy machine, her neck rotating a degree too far, the tendons standing out like cables. There was something profoundly wrong with her silhouette. The proportions were off, her arms seemed slightly too long for her torso, her legs bending with a subtle reverse curve at the knee. She glided toward the hot dog roller, her bare feet making no sound on the linoleum, and I noticed that the roller's ancient wieners, shriveled and splitting, seemed to glisten with an unnatural wetness under her gaze. She pointed a finger at the hot dogs, and I saw her fingernails were packed with dark, organic matter, soil perhaps or something more disturbing. Her voice when it came was a dry rustle, like dead leaves scraping concrete. "I need the oldest meat." The words were drawn out, sibilant, the vowels elongated in a way that made my stomach clench. I laughed, a nervous bark. "Those have been there a while, honestly. Let me put fresh ones on for you on the house." I reached for the tongs, trying to fill the silence with action, but she turned to face me fully then, and my hand froze in midair. Her eyes were not human. They were massive, domed amber in color, with the fibrous, velvety texture of an owl's eyes, set into sockets that were unmistakably human in shape. The pupils were vertical black slits that pulsed rhythmically, contracting and expanding like a heartbeat. They reflected the fluorescent light in a flat, dead way, no depth, no soul. The skin around them was stretched taut, the brow ridge prominent and wrong. As I stared, the lights above us flickered, once, twice, a strobing pulse that fractured reality into frozen snapshots. In those flickers, I saw her shadow stretch up the wall behind her, elongating like a living thing. Antlers branched from her silhouette, twisted and tangled, scraping the stained ceiling tiles. Her arms extended into jointed sticks, the fingers splaying into impossibly long, needle-like digits. The shadow's mouth opened in a silent, screaming gape, a negative space of too many angles, a void that seemed to pull at the light. She whispered a phrase in Navajo, a string of guttural consonants and breathy vowels that I recognized from a story my grandmother, a traditional woman from the Mesa, told me when I was a boy. She said it was a curse, a marking, a thing you prayed never to hear, naaldlooshii. I didn't understand every word, but I knew the meaning. You have been seen. You are known. You are marked. The phrase hung in the air like a scent, and the woman, the thing, smiled. Her lips peeled back too far, revealing teeth that were too long, too numerous, a jumble of sharp canines and flat human molars, the gums dark and glistening. I bolted, I slipped on the polished floor, my sneakers squealing, and I slammed into the back office, throwing the heavy door shut and ramming the deadbolt home. I collapsed against the filing cabinet, my breath heaving, my heart a frantic drum. The office was a claustrophobic box with a desk, a security monitor showing full grainy camera feeds, and a small window that looked out onto the dark, empty parking lot. I stared at the monitor, my blood roaring in my ears. The store was completely empty. The woman was gone. The door hadn't chimed to signal her exit, but the audio feed from the front counter crackled to life, filling the tiny office with a sound that turned my bones to ice. It was my own voice, my exact cadence, my slight lisp, the nervous chuckle I made when I was scared, and it was pleading, desperate, the words tumbling over each other. "Let me in, please. I'm so scared. I just want to go home. Please open the door. She's out here. I can see her, please." The voice was coming from the empty counter, the speaker emitting a perfect mimicry of mortal terror. I watched the monitor, seeing no one, hearing myself beg for mercy. The loop played for 43 minutes, never once deviating, the sobbing, desperate plea repeating with mechanical precision. I sat with my back against the wall, hands clamped over my ears, tears streaming down my face. When the first pale light of dawn touched the red rock mesas, and the sky shifted from black to charcoal, the voice cut off mid-word, leaving a ringing silence that was somehow worse. I walked out of that office at sunrise, quit without collecting my last paycheck, and drove east until the desert was just a memory in the rearview mirror. A week later, my replacement, a college kid named Eric, vanished during his third shift. The morning manager found the store undisturbed, the cash register untouched, but Eric's name tag was inside a sealed plastic package of hot dogs, the plastic unbroken, the tag sitting atop the pink, sweating meat like a garnish. The police called it a bizarre prank. I know better. You don't get seen by one and walk away whole. You just walk away for a while, and you spend the rest of your life flinching at the sound of a door chime in an empty room. Story 2: The Neighbors Hide. We'd been full-time RVers for 2 years, chasing the dream of open skis and national parks, and Dry Hollow was supposed to be a quiet stopover. It sat in a shallow depression surrounded by twisted junipers, their bark peeling like sunburned skin, and sagebrush that scratched the undercarriage as we pulled in. The owner, a man with a permanent squint and a handshake like dried leather, took cash and didn't ask for a name. "Pull in next to Harlan," he said, pointing to a battered silver Airstream that looked like a crumpled beer can. "He's quiet, keeps to himself." We set up camp and my wife, Alina, made a joke about finally having a neighbor who wouldn't blast classic rock. But the silence of that place was heavier than noise. It had weight, a pressure that made your ears ring. Harlan appeared at dusk. He was an old white man, maybe 70, with a wiry frame and skin that had a strange, waxy sheen like a plastic Halloween mask left too long in the sun. It didn't fit quite right. There was a looseness around his jaw, a way his cheeks seemed to shift and resettle when he spoke, as if the tissue underneath was rearranging itself. He set up at his picnic table with a practiced, almost ritualistic efficiency, laying out a stained cutting board and a bone-handled knife with an intricately carved handle. Then he pulled a rabbit from a burlap sack, its eyes still glassy, blood-flecked at the nose, and began to skin it. The knife moved with precision, separating hide from muscle in long, clean strokes. His mouth moved in a silent, repetitive pattern, a constant whispering that never paused. Occasionally he'd look up and smile at us, and his teeth were too uniform, too white, and there seemed to be too many of them crowded into his jaw. On the third night, I was jolted awake by a sound that cut through the dense quiet like a blade, a rhythmic tapping on the rear window of our RV. It was a pattern. A coded knock, asterisk shave, and a haircut, 2 bits. The familiarity of it was almost worse than randomness. I eased out of bed, careful not to wake Alina, and parted the thin curtain a millimeter. The exterior light cast a jaundiced glow on the gravel. Standing on its hind legs, perfectly balanced as if it had done this 1,000 times, was a coyote. Its fur was a dirty grey, matted with burrs, but its front paws were pressed flat against the glass, and they weren't paws. They were hands, pink, hairless, human-like fingers, with dirty nails and knuckles too large for the thin, furred arms. The palms were calloused, the thumb articulated in a way no animal's digit should be. Its head was tipped to one side, ears pricked forward, and its eyes were the exact same flat, amber-brown as Harlan, with the same strange sheen. It tapped the pattern again, delicate and intentional, a polite request for entry. I recoiled, letting the curtain fall, and from outside I heard a soft, breathy laugh, not a coyote's yip, but a human chuckle, thick and wet, as if vocal cords not meant for speech were being stretched. By the time I found the courage to look again, the gravel was empty. In the dirt beneath the window I found tracks, human footprints that started at the tree line, bare deep, and then slowly, over a series of steps, elongated into canine tracks, the toes smearing and reforming as if the bones were shifting mid-stride. The transformation was recorded in the earth. The next morning, Harlan was at our door with a gift, a plastic-wrapped package dripping with condensation. "For the lady," he said, holding out the skinned rabbit, the meat raw and purple, the muscles glistening. His eyes stayed locked on mine while he spoke to Alina, a predatory stillness in his gaze. "Good protein, builds strength." I took it with a mumbled thanks and tossed it in the dumpster the moment he turned away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd watched me do it, that he could see through walls, through skin. That night I couldn't sleep. The air was thick, charged, and the coyotes were silent, always a bad sign. I sat in the dark cockpit of the RV, staring out at Harlan's campsite. He was by the fire pit, the flames guttering low, and he was talking, a low, guttural chant in Navajo that rose and fell like a fever dream. As I watched, he stopped chanting and let out a high, yipping laugh that dissolved into a howl, a sound that blended seamlessly with the wind. Then he began to remove his skin. He hooked his fingers under his jawline and pulled. The skin of his face separated with a wet, tearing sound, peeling back like a latex mask, revealing not muscle and bone but a dark, matted pelt beneath, slick with a clear, viscous fluid. A snout slowly pushed outward, the nasal cartilage cracking and reforming, the black nose twitching. His shoulders popped out of joint with a sickening crunch, his spine curving forward, and the waxy human skin hung loose around his neck like a turtleneck. He was pulling the suit down over a body that was all sharp angles, protruding vertebrae, and an obscenely distended ribcage covered in patchy fur. Then, with a grotesque, practiced motion, he began pulling the skin back on, sealing the seams, smoothing the flesh over his true form as if tucking in a shirt. He was putting the human suit back on backwards methodically, and his face reassembled into Harlan's familiar, too loose features. Then he looked directly at the RV. His face was Harlan, again, but the eyes were inverted, black pits with pinpricks of amber light deep within, like distant campfires in a cave. He smiled, and his mouth opened far too wide, the corners splitting toward his ears, and he spoke a single word, a name. Mine, not my nickname, but my full legal name, the one on my driver's license, the one no one in this desert should know. The sound of it in his mouth was intimate, knowing a violation. We drove out that night, tires screaming on the washboard road, the RV swaying dangerously. In the rearview mirror, I saw Harlan standing in the road, one arm raised in a casual wave, his silhouette limned by the dying fire. As we rounded the bend and the pavement approached, he dropped to all fours and began to run alongside the tree line, keeping pace with our RV at 40 miles per hour. His joints bent the wrong way, his shadow stretching and contracting with each loping stride, and his face, still human, was split in a wide, ecstatic grin. He didn't try to catch us. He just ran, a guardian of the threshold, keeping pace until the trees swallowed him. Alina cried for 3 states. I still have nightmares about that waxy, borrowed skin, and the sound of my name in a mouth that was learning to wear it, practicing for the next time we might meet. Story 3: Dead Man's Curve. The I-40 at 3 a.m. is a lonesome road, a black ribbon cutting through the painted desert where the buttes rise up like the spines of sleeping monsters. My high beams carved a wavering tunnel through the darkness, illuminating mile markers that flashed by with monotonous regularity, their reflective paint glowing like animal eyes. I was driving from Flagstaff to Albuquerque, a route I'd done a dozen times on business, but something about that night felt fundamentally wrong. The stars were too bright and too cold, a scatter of diamond chips against an ink-black sky, and the static on the radio seemed to coil around faint, whispering voices that evaporated the moment I tried to tune them in. I was half lost in a haze of caffeine and exhaustion, my eyelids heavy, when my headlights swept across a figure on the shoulder. A hitchhiker, he stood perfectly still, one arm outstretched, thumb cocked in the classic pose, his body angled toward the road in a posture of weary hopefulness. He wore a faded denim jacket and had his head lowered, a trucker cap shadowing his face. I don't pick up strangers, too many horror stories, too much common sense, so I drove past, my tires humming over the asphalt. Out of some primal, reptilian instinct, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The shoulder was empty. Just the red wash of my taillights on the guardrail and the endless black of the desert beyond. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by a mile marker, a fatigue-induced hallucination. I pressed the accelerator a little harder, the speedometer climbing to 80. 5 miles later, the same man. Same denim jacket, same cap, same outstretched arm. My headlights caught him full in the face this time, and I saw his head rotate to follow my car. It wasn't a normal turn. His neck swiveled with the fluid, inhuman precision of an owl, his face tracking me in a smooth, continuous motion until he was staring directly into my rear window as I passed. The face was a pale oval, featureless in the glare, but the weight of his attention hit me like a physical blow, a pressure on my chest that made me gasp. I floored the accelerator, the engine roaring, the car shuddering as it pushed past 90. The radio erupted in a shriek of static, and through the white noise a voice hissed my name, my full name, my middle name, the one I never use, the one that's on my birth certificate and buried in legal documents. Jonathan Elias Mercer, the voice whispered, each syllable chewed and spat with a wet, clicking relish. We see you on this road. Pull over, Jonathan, we just want to talk. I crossed the state line into New Mexico, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, hoping that the arbitrary border meant something, some ancient protective demarcation. The static died abruptly, leaving a humming, expectant silence. Then I heard a rhythmic thumping from above me, the roof of my sedan. Thump, 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 a pattern identical to a hand pressing flat, then knuckles rapping. It was steady, unhurried, a drummer keeping time with my accelerating heart. I pulled over at a rest stop, bathed in the sickly orange glow of a single sodium light, my hands shaking so badly I could barely shift into park. I grabbed the heavy maglite from my glove box, its weight reassuring, and stepped out into the cold, wind-scoured air. The rest stop was deserted. A concrete picnic table sat under a metal awning, and a payphone receiver dangled from its cord, swaying slightly in the breeze. I circled the car, flashlight beam piercing every shadow. Nothing on the roof. No dents, no scratches. The thumping had stopped the moment I pulled over. I bent down to check the undercarriage, my heart hammering, and that's when I saw the rear window. Written in something dark and coppery, a substance that smelled sharply of iron and roadkill, was a message in blocky, childlike letters. I am still thumbing ***. The letters dripped slowly, tracing rivulets down the glass, forming a small, viscous pool on the trunk lid. I touched it. It was warm, and it stained my fingers a brownish red. I didn't sleep at the next motel. I paid cash for a ground floor room. Locked the deadbolt and pushed the heavy dresser against the door. The curtains were thin, and the parking lot light cast a dim, jaundiced glow through the fabric. I sat with my back against the wall, the maglite in my lap, staring at the window. Around 4 a.m. I heard a faint, wet clicking sound from the parking lot, a rhythmic pattern that started and stopped, like someone dragging a stick across the stucco wall. Then it ceased. A voice, soft and close, as if someone were pressing their lips to the crack under the door, whispered, "You forgot to lock your backseat, Jonathan." I didn't move until sunrise. When the first grey light seeped through the curtains, I checked the car. The back seat was empty, but the upholstery was soaked with a thin, clear fluid that smelled like musk and ozone, a feral electric scent. The message on the rear window was gone, but the paint underneath was etched with the same words, permanent and pale, as if acid had burned them into the clear coat. I sold the car in Albuquerque to a junkyard for scrap and took a Greyhound bus the rest of the way, sitting in the very back, watching the road recede. Sometimes, even now in my third-floor apartment far from any desert, I hear the thumping against my window glass at night, and I never, ever pick up hitchhikers. Story 4: Beneath the Screen. The old Sagebrush Drive-In had been closed since the early 90s, a relic of another America left to rot at the edge of the reservation. The massive screen still stood, a bleached monolith against the stars, its white face pockmarked with birdshot and decades of faded graffiti. The speaker poles jutted from the cracked asphalt like rows of grave markers, their wires dangling, and the concession stand was a collapsed ruin of cinder blocks and shattered glass. We were 6 college kids, chasing cheap thrills and the kind of bad decisions that make for uneasy memories. My friend Marcus, who grew up on the reservation, had refused to come. "That place isn't empty," he said, his voice flat and unyielding, his eyes avoiding ours. "Storytellers talk about the screen. It shows things that aren't supposed to be seen. You shouldn't go." We laughed at him, of course, the invincible laughter of the young and stupid. We packed a cooler of beer, a bottle of cheap whiskey, and some flashlights, and drove out in my truck to the dusty expanse where the desert had begun to reclaim the pavement. We built a small fire in the center of the lot, the flames snapping and popping, casting flickering, dancing shadows on the great white screen. The silhouettes of our group stretched and contracted like living things. We passed the whiskey around, the burn in our throats a counterpoint to the cold desert air, and told ghost stories to scare each other. The stars above were impossibly clear, the Milky Way a river of light, and the silence was so complete that our voices seemed to vanish into it without echo. Around midnight, someone, I think it was Dave, emboldened by the whiskey, dared us to walk to the screen and touch it. "Prove there's nothing there," he said, his grin a slash of white in the firelight. Lena, always the boldest, always the one to accept a dare, jumped up. She was a little unsteady on her feet, but her smile was bright. "Watch me," she said, and she began to walk toward the distant, ghostly rectangle, her footsteps crunching in the gravel. I watched her go, a lone figure moving away from the fire, her silhouette elongated and distorted. Then I saw a second silhouette. It joined hers from the opposite direction, emerging from the absolute blackness at the base of the screen. It was tall, impossibly slender, and it moved on all fours, but the limbs were wrong. The elbows bent backward, rising above the spine with each lurching step, and its head was upturned, its neck craned at an angle that perfectly mirrored Lena's curious, slightly tilted gait. It copied her walk, her pauses, the way she swung her arms, a dark marionette. My blood turned to ice water. I shouted, my voice cracking into the night. "Lena, stop, don't move, don't move." She froze, confused, her silhouette sharp against the firelight, and the creature froze too, perfectly still, a dark mirror. For a long, terrible moment, there was only the crackle of the fire and the pounding of my heart. Then the creature slowly, methodically, rose onto its hind legs, its spine unrolling in segments. It raised one arm, a long, stick-like limb, and Lena's arm rose involuntarily, a marionette on invisible strings. She made a small, choked sound, a whimper of confusion that cut through me. Her mouth opened and a voice came out, but it wasn't hers. It was a deep, guttural chant, a single phrase repeated in perfect Navajo, a language she had no way of knowing. The syllables were harsh, resonant, and they seemed to vibrate in the air. Later, I learned the phrase translated roughly to, "I wear your shape, I taste your shadow." Marcus's warnings echoed in my head, a sickening realization. I screamed at her to run and the spell broke. She stumbled, turned, and sprinted back toward the fire, her face a mask of pure, primal terror, her eyes wide and unseeing. As she crashed into the circle of light, we grabbed her and piled into the truck, the engine roaring to life. As we peeled out in a spray of gravel and dust, I looked back at the screen. The old projector booth, high on its rusted steel tower, had flickered to life, though no electricity ran to this place. A grainy, black and white image was being cast onto the screen, a close-up of Lena's face, her mouth open in a silent, looping scream. But her eyes were hollow, empty windows, and through those windows something was looking out. Something with amber, slitted pupils that tracked our fleeing truck with a calm, predatory interest. The image held until we hit the pavement, then the screen went dark. None of us spoke about it on the drive back. We dropped Lena at her dorm and she wouldn't meet our eyes. 2 weeks later, her roommate called me, her voice tight with fear. Lena had developed a habit of sleepwalking to her full-length mirror and standing there for hours, her reflection smiling at her even when she wasn't, mouthing words in a language she didn't speak. She'd wake with dirt under her fingernails and the smell of sagebrush in her hair. I think about that drive-in every time I drive past an empty lot at night, and I never stop to watch the screen. Story 5, Room 313. I've been a night nurse at the Chinle Comprehensive Health Facility for 6 years, and I've learned that hospitals on reservation land have their own rhythms, their own shadows. The fluorescent lights hum at a different frequency, the halls stretch a little longer after midnight, and the patients sometimes see things that aren't in their charts. Room 313 was our quiet room, reserved for cases that were too unstable, too mysterious, or too disturbing for the general population. It was at the end of a long corridor, where the air always felt 10 degrees colder, and the door had a small, reinforced window that seemed to stare back at you. John Doe 14 arrived one autumn night, found wandering near Canyon de Chelly by a search and rescue team. He was a native man, middle-aged, completely mute and catatonic. His skin had a strange, waxy pallor and it didn't fit. The tissue around his jaw hung in loose, drape-like folds, as if his face were a mask that had been poorly applied and was slowly slipping. His eyes never fully closed, not even when the orderlies tried to tape them shut for what they assumed was comfort. They tracked the staff with pupils that I noticed with a cold, creeping shock were horizontal slits like a goat's set in human irises. Dr. Lassiter, a pragmatic man who didn't believe in anything he couldn't measure, called it a congenital anomaly and signed off. I knew better. I'd grown up hearing the old stories, the warnings about things that wore human shapes but couldn't quite get the details right. One night we admitted a young girl, maybe 8 years old, with a broken arm from a fall near her family's hogan. She was sweet, bright-eyed, and spoke a little English mixed with Navajo. At 2 a.m. during my rounds, I heard a voice from her room, a deep, resonant voice speaking fluent, rapid Navajo. I crept to the doorway and peered in. The girl was sitting straight up in bed, her eyes closed, her mouth moving rapidly, the words spilling out in a cadence that was not her own. The voice was that of an old man, rough with age and wisdom. She was describing, in perfect chilling detail, a scene she had no way of knowing, a grandmother's hogan deep in the Chuska Mountains, a cold winter night and something tapping on the walls. The tapping, she said, came in the pattern of her dead grandfather's knock, the one he used when he came home from hunting. The thing outside used his voice, pleading to be let in. Promising gifts of meat and warm blankets. The grandmother knew the old rules and refused, shouting prayers, drawing a line of ash across the threshold. But the tapping went on for hours, circling the hogan, until the family heard scratching on the roof directly above the smoke hole. The girl in the bed described the exact smell, rotting meat and ozone, a feral electric stench that clung to the back of the throat. She then stopped speaking abruptly and her eyes snapped open. They were rolled back, pure white, the irises vanished. She raised her uninjured arm, the cast bright white in the dim light, and pointed directly toward the door of room 313. "He wears a hospital face now," she said in English, her voice unnervingly flat, devoid of emotion. "But it's not his, he's practicing, he's learning to smile." I backed away, my pulse hammering in my temples, and forced myself to check room 313. The door was closed, the small window dark. I pushed it open, my hand trembling on the cold handle. The bed was empty, the sheets tangled and soaked with a clear, viscous fluid that smelled faintly of animal musk and something acrid, like burnt hair. The window was sealed shut from the inside, the latch locked, the glass intact. On the pillow lay a perfect hollow cast of the man's face. Skin, hair, eyelashes, even the stubble, like a shed snakeskin, still warm to the touch. It held the shape of his features, the exact contours, but it was empty, a discarded shell. I choked back a scream and heard the closet door behind me creak open, the sound slow and deliberate, the hinges groaning. From the darkness of the closet, a voice emerged, soft and cultured, like a doctor delivering a calm, bedside diagnosis. "Nurse, I think I need a new dressing. This one is starting to slip. The seams are coming undone." I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I walked backward, step by agonizing step, my eyes fixed on the empty bed, the discarded face, until I reached the nurse's station. I sat there trembling, watching the hallway, until the morning shift arrived with their bright voices and the clatter of charts. I never worked a night shift again. The official report said John Doe 14 left against medical advice. But I know that somewhere in that hospital, on some quiet hallway when the lights are low, a figure in blue scrubs with a slightly too loose face practices saying "good morning" in a voice that isn't quite human, waiting for someone to answer. Story 6, Two-Legged Buck. My cousin Ray and I had been bow hunting for mule deer in the deep canyons south of Kenta for 3 days. The terrain was rugged, a maze of red rock and pinyon pine, and we'd set up a blind in a thick stand of juniper that overlooked a small, grassy meadow where the deer came to graze at dawn. The first 2 mornings had been silent, just the whisper of wind through the needles and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk. On the 3rd morning, the light was grey and thin, the sun not yet cresting the canyon rim when I saw movement at the edge of the tree line. I raised my binoculars, my breath catching in my throat. It was an enormous buck, a 10-pointer, its antlers branching like gnarled ancient coral, the bone pale against the dark fur. But it stood on 2 legs, not rearing up in alarm or play, not stretching for a high branch, but standing perfectly upright with a relaxed, almost human posture. Its hind legs were planted firmly in the grass, its front hooves dangling at its sides like hands, the joints bent in a way that was utterly wrong. I nudged Ray, pointing. He took the binoculars and his face went slack, the color draining from his lips. "That's not a deer," he whispered, the words barely a breath. The buck turned its head, a slow, deliberate motion, and I saw its eyes through the lenses. They were a brilliant, icy blue, distinctly human, set in that long, angular skull. The nictitating membrane, the 3rd eyelid, swept across them sideways, a pale, milky film. Then it smiled. The lips, black and leathery, pulled back, revealing a nightmare of dentition. Human incisors wedged in front of flat deer molars, the gums raw and red where the alien teeth had pushed through. A voice came from its throat, bizarrely cheerful, resonant and warm, like a morning radio host greeting commuters. "You boys are up early, looking for something. The coffee's not ready yet." Ray, shaking violently, raised his compound bow. I could see the tremor in his arms, the sweat beading on his forehead. He released. The arrow flew true, a whisper of carbon fiber, and struck the buck square in the chest, the broadhead burying itself deep. The creature didn't flinch. It didn't stagger or cry out. It looked down at the protruding shaft with mild, almost academic curiosity, and then it reached up with its front hooves. As we watched, the dark keratin of the hooves split vertically, like a chrysalis, and retracted, revealing long, pale, human-like fingers, the nails cracked and dirty. The fingers flexed, testing the air, and then plucked the arrow from its body as easily as removing a splinter. It held the bloody broadhead up to the light, examined it, and then snapped the carbon shaft in 2 with a casual flick of its wrist. A slow, dark ichor dripped from the wound, thick as sap, but no major bleeding followed, no arterial spray. "You missed the heart," it said, that cheerful voice now edged with a guttural, grinding rasp. "It's smaller than you think. Want to try again? I'll even hold still." It took a step toward us, then another. Its gait was a horrible, striding lope, an ape-like shamble that covered ground with terrifying, jerky speed. The joints popped and cracked with each step, and the human fingers dangled and twitched. We didn't think. We ran. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping our faces, our lungs burning with the thin, cold air. I could hear it behind us, not panting, not animal, but making a soft, rhythmic clicking sound, like a tongue testing the air, tasting our fear. We didn't stop until we reached the truck, miles away, our legs shredded and bleeding from cactus and rock. We sped out of there, the truck bouncing over the rutted dirt track, and it wasn't until we were back on the pavement, the engine cooling, that I noticed the arrow. The two halves, tied together with a strip of fresh sinew, were tucked under the windshield wiper. And on the driver's seat, placed there while we were fleeing, was Ray's hunting license. The paper pierced cleanly through the photo of his face, with a single word scratched into the laminate in clumsy, unpracticed letters. Tagged. Ray hasn't hunted since. He won't even eat venison. But sometimes, when he's camping alone, he swears he hears that cheerful voice from the darkness beyond the firelight, asking if he's still looking for a trophy, if he's ready for another shot. Story 7, The Pool Cleaner. When we moved from Phoenix to a new development in Maricopa, the house was a blank slate of beige stucco and decorative gravel, identical to every other house on the block, butting up against the raw, untamed desert. The only thing we inherited from the previous owner was a pool cleaner. The realtor had found a card taped to the garage door. Fernando Pool Service. Comes Tuesdays at dusk. Good man, cash only. Fernando was a quiet Navajo man, maybe 60, with leathery, sun-darkened skin and deep-set eyes that never seemed to settle on you directly. They'd slide past your face, focusing on a point just over your shoulder, as if he was watching something you couldn't see. He always arrived exactly at dusk, that liminal hour when the sky is a deep bruise and the automatic pool lights click on, staining the water an eerie, phosphorescent blue. He never spoke more than a grunt, never came to the door, never left a bill or an invoice. At first, I thought it was a blessing, a small miracle of convenience. Then I noticed the patterns. He'd stand at the pool's edge for exactly 43 minutes. I timed him once, watching from the kitchen window. The skimmer pole was motionless in his hands, the net barely touching the water. He wasn't cleaning, he was staring, his lips moving in a silent, repetitive whisper, a constant, sibilant stream. The pool itself was always immaculate, the tiles gleaming, the water crystal clear. But the filter basket kept clogging with strange, disturbing debris. Clumps of grey, wiry fur, matted with a clear, jelly-like substance that smelled faintly of musk. And interspersed with the fur were fingernail clippings, some unmistakably human, some too thick, too dark, and too curved to be anything but animal. My wife found a human molar once, caught in the skimmer, a piece of a blue polo shirt still wedged in the roots. The shirt fragment had a faded logo, Maricopa Pool Services. One Tuesday, I decided to watch him more closely. I hid in the garden shed, a small, sweltering box that smelled of gasoline and cut grass, and peered through a crack in the wood as the sky deepened from purple to black. Fernando knelt by the pool's deep end, his movements slow and ritualistic. He began to sing. It was a low, resonant chant, a melody that seemed to vibrate in the concrete under my feet, a sound that was felt as much as heard. The water in the pool rippled, though no wind blew, concentric rings spreading outward from a central point, as if something was rising from the depths. Then he dipped his head into the water, fully submerging his face. He held it there for an impossibly long time, his body perfectly still, not a bubble surfacing. When he pulled his head out, the water sluiced off and his face was different. It was a coyote's face, fur plastered down against the skull, ears pricked and turning, a black nose twitching at the air. The human mask had slipped, hanging loosely around his neck like a cowl, the empty eyeholes staring blankly. He shrugged off his blue coveralls, and I had to clamp a hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. His body was a horrific patchwork of different hides, stitched together with thick, waxy sinew, a deer's pelt here, what looked like a dog's flank there, patches of pale, hairless human skin with moles and scars, all sewn into a grotesque quilt. The seams were infected, weeping a faint phosphorescent fluid that glowed a sickly green in the pool lights. He dove into the pool without a splash, his body merging with the blue-lit water, and he didn't resurface. I waited, shivering for an hour, my eyes straining at the still water. Nothing. I drained the pool the next day, telling my wife there was a chemical imbalance, a lie that tasted like ash. At the bottom, wedged into the main drain cover, I found a collection of objects that weren't ours. A woman's gold wedding ring inscribed with a date, a small Ziploc bag containing a lock of coarse black hair tied with a red thread, and a laminated employee ID badge for a Fernando Biguet, pool technician, issued 6 years earlier. The photo showed a younger man, smiling, his eyes clear and human. But the badge was corroded, pitted, as if it had been submerged in something acidic for years. My neighbor, an old-timer who'd lived in the area for decades, later told me that the real Fernando had gone missing 5 years ago, and the company had simply sent a replacement without notice. The thing had been maintaining the pool and the house ever since, waiting, I believe, for an invitation to step inside, for us to leave a door unlocked, to offer a glass of water, to say the words that would let it cross the threshold. We moved within the month. I still find clumps of grey fur in the air vents sometimes, and I never swim at night. Story 8, Last Chair. I worked the lift at Arizona Snowball, Chair 3, the one that climbs through the dense aspen groves to the upper bowl, where the expert runs cut through volcanic rock. It was February, and a whiteout was rolling in like a slow-moving curtain of static, the snowflakes stinging and thick, reducing visibility to a few feet. The mountain was shutting down, the last skiers having descended an hour ago, their colorful jackets swallowed by the storm. I was in the operator's shack, a small heated box with a single window, running the final safety check to bring the chairs into the barn for the night. The wind howled, rattling the metal, and the radio crackled with reports of road closures. I was alone, looking forward to a hot meal and a warm bed, when I saw a figure emerge from the tree line. A lone skier, no car in the empty parking lot, no gear bag, no poles. He wore an old-style fur parka, the kind you see in black and white photos, sewn from a dozen mismatched pelts, coyote deer something darker. The hood was up, shadowing his face. He moved with an effortless, gliding stride, his skis barely seeming to touch the snow as if he were skimming the surface. He stopped at the loading ramp, a dark silhouette against the white chaos, and raised a pole. "One more ride up?" he asked. His voice was a whisper carried by the wind, barely audible, yet perfectly clear, as if it bypassed my ears and spoke directly inside my head. It was against every rule, every safety protocol, but something in his posture, the weary slump of his shoulders, the simple, almost humble request made me relent. "Last one," I said into the intercom, and I waved the chair around. He slid onto the seat with a smooth, fluid motion, and I watched him ascend, a dark shape dissolving into the swirling snow. As the chair climbed, maybe 30 feet up, he turned to look back at me. The distance didn't blur the clarity of his face. He wasn't wearing goggles, and the hood had blown back. Where his eyes should have been, there were deep, dark sockets filled with glinting, iridescent beetle shells, dozens of them, their tiny legs twitching and shifting, receding into his skull in a constant, writhing motion. They caught the red glow of the lift's emergency light and glittered like 1,000 tiny eyes. He raised a gloved hand in a slow wave, and I saw the glove had 6 fingers, an extra thumb protruding from the wrist at an unnatural angle, twitching independently. The chairlift motor let out a grinding metallic shriek and died. The emergency brakes engaged, and the line went slack, the chairs swinging violently in the wind. He was dangling 40 feet above the slope, a dark pendulum. Then he simply stood up. He didn't fall, he stepped off the chair as if stepping onto a curb, his feet finding purchase on the empty, snow-filled air. He walked on the wind, his body bobbing slightly, testing the invisible surface like an animal on thin ice. He landed softly on the snow-packed ramp below, his skis hissing against the powder. I saw now that the skis were not attached to boots, they were fused to his legs, the plastic and metal melded with bone and sinew, the flesh growing around the bindings. He began to climb the steel lift tower next to my shack, his hands and feet gripping the cold metal with a skittering, insectile speed, the beetle eyes in his sockets reflecting my own horrified face back at me. The wind carried his voice, but it resonated inside my skull, a calm, almost apologetic tone. "Last run is always the most dangerous. The mountain remembers who rides alone, it gets hungry." I scrambled into the inner control room, a steel box with a single porthole, and locked the heavy door. All night, I heard the sound of skis carving perfect, aggressive turns on the metal roof of the shack, the scraping of edges digging into the sheeting, a slalom back and forth above my head. The thing was skiing on the roof, making parallel turns, and occasionally it would whistle a tune that sounded like a lift ticket flapping in a gale. The whistling would pause and a voice would drift down, casual and conversational. "Nice snow tonight, eh? Good base, you should come out." When dawn broke and the storm cleared, I emerged to find the roof scored with long, parallel grooves, as if a giant razor had been drawn across it in elegant, sweeping arcs. On the control panel inside, written in frost that wouldn't melt even with the heaters on full blast, was a single word: again. I quit that spring, moved to the desert, and I never ski anymore. But sometimes when the wind howls, I think I hear the scrape of edges on metal, and that cheerful, horrible voice asking for one last ride. Story 9, Heat Signature. I'm a wildlife biologist contracted by the tribal government to survey bighorn sheep populations in a restricted section of Canyonland, a place where the old stories are still told in whispers. My job is solitary and technical. I fly a high-end thermal drone, a $40,000 rig, equipped with an infrared camera that paints the world in ghostly gradients of blue, green, and orange. The drone can fly for hours, its rotors a steady hum, and I sit in my truck with the monitor, counting heat blobs that resolve into sleeping deer, a coyote slinking through the sage, or the round, warm shapes of bighorn sheep bedded down on a cliff ledge. The work is hypnotic, meditative, and deeply lonely. 2 weeks ago, I saw something that made me question every rational bone in my body. It was 11 p.m., the moon a thin sliver, and I was flying a standard grid pattern over a remote mesa that had no official name, just a number on a map. The monitor glowed in the dark of my truck cab, the heat signatures rendered in false color. Suddenly, a blazing orange shape erupted onto the screen, moving fast. I zoomed in, my heart rate spiking. It was a humanoid shape, but it was running on all fours. I've seen thermal images of bears, mountain lions, even a stray horse. This was different. The spine twisted in a fluid, serpentine motion that would shatter any human vertebrae. The limbs were too long, the joints bending in the wrong direction, and it was moving at a speed I calculated at nearly 60 miles per hour. It covered a mile in a minute, sprinting across the mesa with a terrifying, effortless purpose, a blur of heat. I banked the drone to follow, my hands trembling on the controls. The thing stopped abruptly in a clearing of bare rock, and I zoomed the camera to maximum magnification. It turned its head and looked directly up at the drone, 1,000 feet above. The thermal image was startlingly clear. A face with an elongated snout, tall, pointed ears, and eyes that burned white-hot against the cooler blue of the skin. Then on my screen, its heat signature duplicated. A second identical shape peeled away from the first, like a cell dividing under a microscope, the thermal energy splitting cleanly. Then a third. All three stood on their hind legs, their heads tilted back, and they raised their long, thin arms toward the sky, toward the drone, as if reaching up. The altimeter on my screen began to drop. Rapidly, I wasn't touching the altitude controls. The drone was being pulled down as if by an invisible, insistent hand. The camera feed glitched violently, the thermal image breaking apart into digital snow, a storm of pixels. For a single, frozen frame, the image was replaced with a perfectly clear, high-resolution picture. My own face staring up from the mesa floor, the thermal colors inverted. My skin was cold blue, my eyes burning pits of orange fire, my mouth open in a silent scream. It was as if my soul were looking up from the ground, a mirror image of my own terror, a portrait of my fear. The drone crashed into the rocks. The last transmission was an audio burst, a chorus of voices, young and old, male and female, chanting in Navajo, counting down from 10. The final distinct words before the signal died were, "We see you in the sky. We see you in the sky." I drove out there the next morning, my hands still shaking on the wheel. The drone was a wreck, its carbon fiber body smashed on the red rock. But the surface was covered in tiny, overlapping handprints, as if a crowd of children had tried to pry it open. The handprints were etched into the material, impossible to scrub off, the faint impressions of 2 long fingers and sharp, claw-like tips. I erased all the data, told my supervisor the drone malfunctioned due to a firmware glitch, and requested a transfer to a desk job far from the field. But at night in my apartment in Flagstaff, I sometimes hear a faint, rhythmic beeping, the exact same pattern as the drone's telemetry signal, coming from my laptop, even when it's turned off. And once, looking out my window at the dark street, I saw a figure standing under a streetlight, perfectly still, its head tilted back as if searching the sky. Story 10, The Storyteller's Skin. In Dene tradition, we tell certain stories only in the winter months, when the spirits are asleep under the snow and cannot hear their names being spoken. To tell them in summer is to invite attention, to be heard by things that should remain sleeping. My great-uncle Hostin Yazzie was one of the last storytellers who remembered the old, dangerous tales, the ones that were never written down, passed from mouth to ear across centuries. He was a small man, weathered by decades of desert sun, his face a map of deep, intricate wrinkles, his eyes clouded with cataracts but still sharp with a sly, unsettling intelligence. One bitter December night, with the wind screaming through Canyon de Chelly and the fire snapping and popping in the hearth of his hogan, I asked him to tell me a story about skinwalkers. He was silent for a long moment, the firelight carving his face into a mask of shadow and light, and then he nodded slowly. He poured a thin, careful line of corn pollen across the threshold, a protection, and settled into his worn armchair, pulling a wool blanket over his knees. "There was once a skinwalker," he began, his voice a low, rhythmic drone that seemed to blend with the wind, who envied the human family. It watched a man return to his hogan every evening, saw the way his wife greeted him, the way his children ran to him. It saw the warmth of the fire, the taste of stew, the comfort of belonging, and it wanted that warmth, so it learned to peel the skin from a victim, slowly, carefully, so as not to tear, and wear it like a coat. It would sit at the dinner table, the human skin draped over its true form, and it would try to say, "I love you," to the children. But the only sounds that came out were animal yelps and the chittering of insects and the grinding of stones. The children would scream, and the skinwalker, in its frustration, would have to kill them to silence the noise, to try again with a different family. It practiced for centuries, learning the shapes of words, the inflections of affection, the precise way a father ruffles a child's hair. As he spoke, I noticed his voice had changed. It had become higher, more strained, as if someone were pushing the words through a throat not their own, a throat that wasn't built for human speech. The firelight seemed to carve his features into sharper relief, and I saw a faint, silvery line running from behind his right ear down the side of his neck, disappearing under the collar of his shirt. It was a seam, delicate and precise, like the stitching on a finely made coat. My blood turned to ice water. The Hogan suddenly felt too small, the shadows too deep. I leaned forward, my mouth dry, and whispered, "Uncle, who are you telling this story about?" He stopped speaking. The fire popped loudly, sending a shower of sparks spiraling up the smoke hole. He reached up with a hand that seemed to have too many joints, the fingers too long, the knuckles too prominent, and he pressed a finger to the seam, tapping it gently, rhythmically. His lips stretched into a smile that was too wide, the corners splitting toward his ears, and the inside of his mouth was not pink, healthy flesh but a dark, furred cavity, and his tongue was not a tongue but something long, black, and segmented that uncurled to taste the air, its tip forked. "A very old relative," he said, his voice now a perfect, resonant mimicry of my late grandfather's voice, a voice I hadn't heard since I was a child standing by his knee. The warmth of it, the familiar cadence, made my eyes sting with tears even as my heart hammered in terror. "Do you think I've learned to say it right yet? I love you. I've been practicing for such a long, long time. I think I'm getting close." I stared at the dirt floor, my heart a war drum, and I did not look up. I could hear the thing breathing across from me, a wet, labored sound, the air rattling in a chest that was not built right. The fire crackled and the wind howled, and I stayed frozen, my eyes fixed on the earthen floor, until the first grey light of dawn seeped through the smoke hole and the fire had died to cold ash. When I finally raised my eyes, my great-uncle was asleep peacefully in his chair, his breathing deep and even, his face relaxed. The seam was gone. His skin was his own, lined and familiar. But on the low wooden table between us lay a small square of tanned, leathery hide, still warm to the touch, the edges cleanly cut. Burned into its surface in a script older than human writing, a series of whirls, angles, and concentric circles that seemed to shift and writhe in my peripheral vision, were the words "I love you" in English, the letters clumsy but legible. I still don't know if the man in the chair was my great-uncle, and the skin was a gift the storyteller left behind as a gesture of something almost understood, or if the thing that wore his skin that night finally learned enough to leave a piece of itself behind. I visit him every winter, and I never, ever stay past sunset. I bring corn pollen, and I listen to his stories, and I watch his face for seams.